Today's webinar topic is California's SB 553, Workplace Violence Prevention Plan Law that goes into effect officially July 1st, so coming up quick. Presenting to you today will be Steve Hamilton and Mike Vallier with Berkshire Hathaway Home State Company. Steve is a loss control supervisor at BHHC and has been in the safety space for over 20 years. He is a member of the American Society of Safety Professionals, as well as an esteemed educator with OSHA compliance for Berkshire Hathaway clients throughout the US. Mike is a senior loss control specialist at BHHC with over 25 years of experience in safety, compliance, and risk mitigation. He has been practicing and training on threat assessment, active shooter, and workplace violence since 2017, and is certified by the National Association of Safety Professionals as a workplace violence prevention specialist. As Steve Parkhurst with Heffernan said, Berkshire Hathaway has graciously offered to do this training for us today, and we are most grateful. However, please note that if you are not a client of Berkshire Hathaway, this is still amazing information, and Heffernan does have some hands-on support and resources to provide our clients. So feel free to reach out to myself, Steve Parkhurst, or anyone within Heffernan. We would be happy to assist. So without further delay, I give you Steve and Mike.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. So during the course of this presentation, I will be kind of hiding my face just so you can focus really on the presentation. But thank you for the great introduction. I think I speak for Steve with that. So again, very hot topic. You know, I would tell you that workplace violence is probably the #1 issue that we here at BHHC have been helping our customers deal with it. And so especially when we talk about the new compliance obligations that the state of California has created for us. So the workplace violence topic, it's a very broad one, right? It covers a lot of material. And although much of the material that we'll be talking about today will be heavily focused for California regulations, the material we talk about can be implemented nationally, right? And we'll touch on that, how we do that. So if you're in other states, there are existing and legacy workplace violence standards that apply. And although we will go through mainly California standards, we want you also to have a resource at the end of this presentation. So we'll be talking about non-California standards and workplace violence in general. We do have a large audience today. That's great to hear, and welcome to everybody there. So thanks again to Steve for assisting. He'll be fielding questions on the Q&A chat. And I know he'll do his very best to get you your questions as fast and as accurate as he can. So thank you for your questions in advance. And thank you, Steve, again for helping. Okay, so today we'll cover mainly compliance and standards, both very important. But our hope, again, is that the material presented will help your organization be a more safe and secure place to work, right? That's what we're here to do. We want that the resources that we share with you today, you'll take back to your workers and work partners and ensure that they have the best opportunity and you have the best opportunity to have workplace safe from harassment, bullying, and of course, violence. And so when we talk about compliance, especially around workplace violence hazards, remember that OSHA regulations, like us here in California, those are minimum standards. Those are minimum standards always. And so when we think about best in class, yes, we want you to be compliant, but as we all have likely been thinking about this new standard set forth by California, it's important that at the end of the day, your efforts and own agenda is really keenly focused on getting a workplace violence prevention plan together that, yes, reduces risk, but also is specialized to, right, and fits your organization well. It has to fit your organization. And these are the points we'll be talking about. We'll talk about workplace violence. We will make sure to talk about the recent California bills that drove this presentation more than anything. Bullet point 3 there, you can see we'll discuss and want to ensure that you have the roadmap to be successful. Really, whether you're in Nevada or Novato, we want to make sure you have all of the resources you need to develop an effective workplace violence prevention plan. And of course, have the processes in place to implement those, regardless of what industry you may be in. We're going to talk about some implementation dates specific to California as well. We will discuss a little bit about how to comply with those regulations, or at least enhance your compliance. We want to be compliant. And then we're going to give you some next steps, some strategies, right, on how to be successful. Again, if you have any questions, drop them in the Q&A. We'll be answering those questions. And if we happen not to be able to get to any by the end of this presentation, as Lisa talked about, you have them as a resource. You have us if you're a policyholder with Berkshire Hathaway Home State. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand by reaching out to your rep or your loss control partner. Does that work? Okay. So let's dive right in. Why are we going to talk about workplace violence? So I would tell you that the statistics are pretty astronomical. Nearly 2 million workers in the US are victims of workplace violence. That's every year. And that's an astounding number of people being impacted by harassment, bullying, and violence exposures and the risk potential, right? So as we talked about, the recent changes in California law were driven by an event in 2021 in San Jose, California, involving a workplace violence shooting that occurred at a VTA facility. Unfortunately, there were multiple fatalities, and of course, just a very unfortunate mass casualty for the business and also the community. And with that event, it highlighted the exposure with California state legislature, the risk across all of the industries, right? Not just the VTA in that specific industry. They took a look at it broad scale, and they determined it would be wise to address workplace violence in a more broad way, implement controls around the risk. And that is really what's driving these bills in California, okay? Now, taking a look at some statistics across the US, you can see a 2020 CDC study that showed 20,000 workers in the US suffered some type of trauma related to workplace violence. 73% of those were females. 62 involved employees were between the ages of 25 and 54, but a very large portion of these employees were in healthcare and social services. So it's very topical, areas of risk potential that lots of employees should be addressing on a employers should be addressing on a proactive basis, excuse me. That same study determined that 81% of the employees involved were men. So a lot of exposure there across all spectrum of industries for everyone. In California, there were 13 workplace violence incidents, fatalities last year, and I'll tell you, likely on pace to exceed that number in 2024 already. And we just had a couple of weeks ago, I think, 4 mass shootings over the weekend that weren't so heavily televised. So if you think about 2024, 13, that's 13 too many. So we want to ensure that we're giving you all the resources to do the right thing and protect our employees, and not just for compliance, but again, doing the right thing, preventing the risk of injury at your workplace. Know the rules. Make sure you're addressing the rules that are specific to your own specific regulatory agency, Cal OSHA or otherwise. Again, here in California, but there are several states, right, that have very specific rules that we call vertical standards that apply to certain industries. For example, California, Connecticut, Illinois, Maryland, Minnesota, those states have Fed OSHA standards that apply specifically to healthcare. So if you're in one of those states, you want to make sure that whatever program you're developing, you address those elements of compliance to be right with that OSHA standard. Okay, here in California, these bills that were recently enacted, all employers across the board, regardless of your operation or industry, are required to have some kind of workplace violence prevention program as of July 1st, and we'll get more into that. There are some exceptions, excuse me, and we'll go into those. But again, we want you to do the right thing. We don't want you to focus so much on compliance. Although we'll talk about compliance, we want you to have all of the elements that you need to have a solid workplace violence prevention plan in place so your employees are safe. We know that workplace violence is an act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. And we'll delve deeper into that a little bit later. But there is an OSHA GDC OSHA Act general duty clause that's contained within that act. And I encourage you to take a look at it. But really, the summary states that all employees in all states have an obligation and a duty to maintain a workplace that's free of hazards. And free of hazards could be a safety issue. It could be some other kind of concern that would cause an injury or death. It also covers workplace violence. So employers, based on the general duty clause from OSHA, have an obligation to keep their employees and workplace safe and secure. And California has expanded into this, and that's where we're at today. Let's next take a look at how workplace violence impacts us, right, and our people. So in this slide, we're going to share information from the National Safety Council, and what we know, it's a fact that workplace violence incidents impact employees in a great way. We know that, right? But it also affects employers and organizations, right? We know that workplace violence affects absenteeism, the ability for your employees to actually be at work. If there's an exposure, if there's a risk potential, they are more likely to file a health-related workers' comp claim. And those are the facts. And of course, we really don't want that. We want to have we want to try and have these programs in place to prevent risk and injuries. Turnover. Turnover is much higher if your workplace has a potential for workplace violence, right? We'll talk about psychological safety, but in this space, as we talk about workplace violence, turnover tends to be much higher, and that leads to additional cost for an employer, like replacing employees, which for our HR partners here on the call know that all too well. There's also indirect costs, right? What we call indirect costs, replacing employees, training those employees, giving them the tools they need to do their job if turnover is very high. So workplace violence can affect your bottom line in lots of ways. Absolutely, productivity. We think about money lost in potential litigation. There are medical expenses, things that your work comp carrier has to pay for additionally that are passed on to the policyholders. So workplace violence really drives a lot of costs in a very significant way. The other thing that I think it's important for you to know, that if you're an employer or if you own a company and you're listening to this presentation, there's even unforeseen that and other aspects of business costs that could be impacted by workplace violence. So, a couple of other things, your brand. I think when we think about, uh, you know, uh, intangibles, your brand, you really don't want your company involved with a workplace violence incident. Just think about that. You don't want to be in the media. You don't want to be in a post or a news sharing an active shooter incident or an investigation that happened, where you work or the company you own. So the potential negative impact to your bottom line and brand cannot be overstated. So again, there are obviously many reasons and rationale for implementation of a solid, thorough workplace violence program for your organization. But I would tell you prevention efforts are key. They are really important. Okay, let's next get into what you need to do or know, or both, to identify what types of exposures you can be dealing with workplace violence, right? So we know that workplace violence is broken down into 4 categories. And these 4 categories, as we get through them, it's important for you to know and talk about, definitely, for one, for your knowledge, and 2, for record-keeping purposes. Type 1 is criminal intent. And so this would be a situation where the offender, the perpetrator, doesn't have a relationship with the business or its employees, and the violence is usually committed, paired with or alongside a crime, such as shoplifting. It could be trespassing, robbery. That's type 1. Type 2 would be a customer client type of category. So this is where an offender has a relationship with the workplace. Typically, they could be receiving service or some type of care. This type of violence has a historically high incident rate in healthcare settings, and includes patients and their families or other visitors. So that's customer client is type 2. Type 3 is worker on worker. We often call this lateral or horizontal violence, worker on worker. The offender or perpetrator is a coworker, and it can be the result of a power imbalance. This is where worker relationships are strained. For example, supervisor to supervisee or vice versa. We'll get more into worker on worker here in a bit, and that's type 3. And then the last type, commonplace, is a personal relationship. This offender has a relationship with the victim outside of the work and has an impact on the work environment. This is typically what's often referred to potentially as a domestic spillover or a domestic issue, spouse to spouse, husband to wife to husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, vice versa, or other. And that's type 4. There is a new fifth one that's emerging, and it's important to note, specifically under SB 553, kind of a asterisk type 5, animal attacks. Animal attacks under SB 553 are also considered workplace violence and can include really any type of violence involving an animal exposure and attack. So important that we know that, important that we record and log that, and we'll get into some examples there. Going back to type 1 and 2, those type 1 and 2s, which is a criminal intent and customer client, they're more often going to be impacting those businesses that are public facing, right? So we think about the service industry, those kinds of things when you're dealing with customers. Type 3 and 4, worker and personal relationship, those are really difficult to tease out because they can impact any industry anywhere. But I think this is true for all 4 types, right? And really, no matter who initiates a confrontation, always, right, the risk of injury or loss of life, it can be real. I think when we think about the deadliest types of incidents, we think of obviously active shooter, mass shooter, and this is someone who's actively engaged in hurting, harming, killing, or attempting to hurt people in a confined or populated area. It's generally agreed that healthcare industry is the most susceptible to workplace violence. I think the studies show that the healthcare industry has been tracking and studying workplace violence longer than any other industry. And it's often at the hands of either like an unstable or disgruntled patient. But it's also agreed upon that customer service roles and responsibilities is also very high risk. And so looking at those 4 types of workplace violence, workers with customer-facing responsibilities are technically 4 for 4 in terms of exposure. So as we go through the presentation, you'll hear me talk about, workplace violence, unfortunately cannot be prevented 100%. But what will definitely support preventing violence in your organization is be able to identify and assess the different type of exposures so you can risk assess. And we'll talk about that and build prevention plans to identify the violence. You know, lastly, I would say that, whether it's a verbal threat, a robbery, a domestic spillover issue, be the well-informed employer who provides a thorough workplace violence prevention plan, builds awareness, coaches awareness, invests in physical security and training. It's a must do. And I think that's why we're out here today, right? To talk through that. The next evolution in assessing risk we need to identify is who's at risk of workplace violence. So you can see on the slide, we've listing varying types of industries, individuals that handle money, retail establishments, convenience stores. When we think about alcohol exposures, bars, restaurants, thinking about delivery exposures, think of rideshare companies, exposures in the cannabis industry and emerging industry. Those all resonate, right? We think about industries with large delivery roles, business, schools, Head Start programs, daycare centers, anywhere there's an opportunity for individuals to interact with employees in this way, formal or otherwise, right? I'm thinking healthcare, social service providers, mental health advocates who work in the community. Those are the employees that are very high risk of workplace violence just because of the nature of the business, right? The nature of the industry. And of course, you throw in the unpredictability of the customers or patients. many high incidents and when studies are done around workplace violence show in industries where employees work alone, right? Or off hours, late hours, workers who work in, urban or high crime areas. But again, I'll say this, there are no absolutes. There are no black and whites. I think many workplace violence incidents tend to manifest themselves in workplaces where there's very close relationships, both, from relationship status, but also in close proximity to another. An example would be a distribution center, a warehouse, a processing, or maybe a packing line. It may turn into a volatile situation many times because of how close they are in proximity with other people. I think about cubicles that potentially are really lined up and next to each other. So proximity, we think about that. You may be having two workers that work next to each other that don't like each other, or maybe one is being perceived as being bullied by that person. So just know that these are some of the employees who are at high risk. So extra efforts should be made in these scenarios to address workplace violence and so in a proactive way. And so when building your plan, take a worm's eye view, right, of all the hazards that your workers, your employees are facing, and that we just talked about. Okay, let's talk law now. So we're going to talk about some specifics around creating a workplace violence prevention program. I think, but before we do, I want to go into a couple of bills that were passed. So we have some context around the new mandates. So again, if you're in California, these are those bills we're talking about. I'm going to talk just briefly as it would be easy to get caught up on the first bill, definitely, specifically as it does tend to have the most what ifs, a lot of questions and many hundreds, if not thousands of scenarios we wouldn't be able to get to on this call. So you do have resources, but I do want to touch on it a little bit and introduce SB 428. So this is the first bill. This is bill one of two, and what is known as a TRO, that's a temporary restraining order. This again is a companion bill to the new workplace violence regulation that's set forth by Cal OSHA SB 553, which we'll get into. So really the overview is and the scope of SB 428 is really limited, and it supports SB 553. SB 428 helps to clarify more closely and define TROs as it relates to workplace violence. I think TROs and temporary restraining orders have always been around, but I think when you think about SB 428, it was really specialized and written to assist employers and giving them an outlet to protect their employees at their workplace. This bill gives employers guidance on what can be used to help reduce the risk of violence from a legal standpoint. And remember, the bill, when you read it, and you should, says may rather than must or shall. So the difference in the language is telling, though it still puts the onus of decision making on you, the employers. And as it stands right now, the bill does not speak to liability. So we would definitely recommend here at BHHC that you speak with your counsel or other resources before delving into SB 428, as there's a lot more and really robust information and language that you really should wrap your hands around before enacting it. Continuing with SB 428, so the scope of this part of this bill is really limited. As we mentioned, it does support SB 553. It helps clarify. It gives you a lot of language. I think one important thing I want to note is although an individual may seek a restraining order on behalf of him or herself or themselves or family members, that's now the California law. Only employers can ask for a workplace violence restraining order under SB 428. And again, I just want to reiterate, for liability reasons, we can't go into giving guidance on specific situations. I don't see any specific ones there on our Q&A. Great. So we always recommend, again, seeking assistance from your own legal counsel when appropriate. And if it happens to come to that, right? And so that's SB 428, Senate Bill 428. The primary bill that's driving the new workplace violence regulations and all of the elements we'll get into deeper here is SB 553. And while the state has several existing laws in place to protect workers and establish a duty of care for employers, this amendment put forth in the Senate bill really, their aim is to strengthen that, right? And as we know, many California laws, definitely with safety, which are enacted in the state, tend to spread to the rest of the US, sometimes even globally, right? So understanding the importance of understanding the components and implementation is really important, even if your business is currently only based in California. A couple of telling points here. So SB 553 was introduced by Senator Dave Cortese. He's up from the Northern California, I think over San Jose and other parts of Santa Clara County. And so, as we mentioned, the genesis of the introduction of this new legislation was the 2021 Valley Transportation Authority mass shooting in San Jose. So thinking about this, and as we, talk through the SB 553, I think the reality of our everyday lives is, this bill makes perfect sense. I mean, think of yourself as through the employee lens. Workplace violence is currently and will continue to be a significant issue. Most companies, the studies tell us, have had some type of workplace violence incident or will have one in the future at some point. One recent study I'll share is a Gallup poll that they pulled. This is a 2022 study. They pulled, I think it was 5,000 HR professionals nationally. 50% of the HR professionals polled reported that the business had experienced at least one workplace violence incident. And so we're talking about half. And the other statistic that I would pair with that is, studies show us that 25% of workplace violence incidents are never reported at all. So I think you can do the math there. This is a growing trend, unfortunately, and so it's important. So with SB, it's important we talk about it. So with SB 553, compliance isn't only important, but also mandatory, right? It should be part of your business planning. And so the interpretation of this bill, although having subtle differences and some openness to interpretation, it is pretty straightforward and very actionable and dual. So we have to continue to look at these amendments as another way to invest in our workplace safety. So important. And for us in California, Cal OSHA will be charged with enforcing this standard. That's will be coming out and eventually inspecting, and they'll also be responsible to continue to rule make and even possibly build on top of this regulation. So I hate to say this is just the beginning in a negative way, but this is a start. Hopefully we can get you on the right direction to be able to start creating your plan from scratch. And if you're already built it, give you some other tips and tricks to make your plan even stronger. For those on the call that are not yet in California, understand that other states are also looking at SB 553, right? And the elements of this bill and taking a wait and see approach to enact something similar in their states. I know two offhand for sure. So again, be prepared and ready to do the right thing and adopt these mandates or at least some parts of them. Okay, let's talk a little through some exemptions. A caveat here, I would tell you as a longtime safety professional, I would encourage all employers, regardless of this exemption list, to develop thorough protocols for dealing with violence at your work. From a work comp perspective, and again, as a safety professional, and you all on this call, very important. I think our collective goal should be, right, to reduce the risk of injury to our people as much as possible. Effective workplace violence safety protocols are the best way to accomplish this. So those in other states, again, take a look at the elements of this bill. Try not to look at the exemptions, right? And we talk about doing the right thing and implement some good, solid controls. For us here in California, you can see them listed on the screen. So if you're in a workplace that's already addressed by some other standard, a vertical standards is what we call it. If you're in healthcare, there's a different standard that can apply, or elements are very similar. So if you're complying with those in healthcare, you're in a much better shape. So law enforcement agencies, police departments, etc., don't have to comply workplaces that are not open to the public or have less than 10 employees, excuse me. don't have to comply. The reality is that many of us may look at our workplace and think, well, we're not open to the public technically, right? So I don't have to comply. Well, think about that. You think about call centers, you think about construction zones, just to name a couple. The reality is, unless they have, some really stringent physical security controls with access controls or guards, they can be accessed by really anybody, the public. As an example, construction job sites aren't, quote unquote, open to the public. But I don't think there's ever a job site I haven't been on that a high visibility vest and a hard hat couldn't give me access to. And so susceptible to the workplace violence. And I can guarantee you there are limited spaces that someone with bad intentions can access. I think when there's a will, there's a way. So think through that when you go through your risk assessments. Are you really close to the public? So we think about these exceptions are as they may, but we have to think about the risks, right? We have to think about the risk involved with other workers. So again, I would encourage you to know, again, do the right thing, be above and beyond standards that might not apply whether you're in, California or Michigan or Texas. Be above and beyond, okay? Try to come up with a program that addresses your risk potential in a very specific way and give your employees those tools to be safe. Remember that best-in-class companies address safety regardless of regulatory agency exception guidance. We go back to, doing the right thing for our employees, and we'll touch on that, and we'll say that again and again. Okay, now just some specifics on definitions around workplace violence. So workplace violence really means any act of violence or threats, right, of violence that occurs in employment. It could be very specific threat like, hey, John's going to come back. He has a gun and he's going to hurt somebody. Now, that's a very specific statement. It could also be a social media post, right? I think that's a question we get very often. That social media post could involve a threat of violence to somebody from your workplace or at your workplace. It could be the spouse of somebody who's in your workplace. It could be a very broad threat of violence posted again on Facebook or some other social media sites, even internal social media platforms. It may not even be specific to your own office or place of work, but even to your industry. A recent example we were talking about was someone threatening DoorDash, the organization, right? Because, quote, they can never get my order right. Obviously, someone that's unstable, or for us, as trivial as it may sound, this can put all delivery drivers at risk with this individual. It's what's really known as a terroristic threat. So make sure we are aware of our hazard. This is a very different world than it was 15, 20 years ago. You have to make sure as an employer you understand that workplace violence is what it is, and then address the risk in a very proactive way. Okay, and so this is your roadmap. If you're in California again, SB 553 is the new law, and you have to comply with these elements. You have to have a written plan and include the elements of this program. So let's get into it. You must have a written workplace violence prevention plan. Again, truly, when you think about having a plan, we're talking about a crisis management program, right? And it should encompass different scenarios and different procedures to address the different forms of workplace violence that you have in your specific industry, company, organization, what have you. This includes harassment. How do we handle harassment? What is harassment? Active shooter incidents. Really any other type of violent attacks. Those are important that we're addressing in the plan. I think one thing that we have to consider and can't forget is looking at your employees, looking at your workforce. What is their primary language? We have to think that when we think about gauging our workforce and training our workforce. So think through that. Your workers have to be involved with feedback of your plan. It has to be accessible and free of charge for your workers. And there has to be some clear definition of responsibility within that program. There has to be assessment protocols and response protocols. There should be alert protocols or alert notification protocols, excuse me. There has to be a system of identifying the potential for active shooter. You have to have a workplace violence incident log. and we'll have some tools for that. We'll talk here about it here in a little bit. You must have designated employees who understand the rules, what the rules are, right? If you have a union or work with organized labor, you have to involve them in a very clear way. You should also determine the need, right? So there's some peripheral ancillary jobs that you have to coordinate with. Think about employers that have custodial services, potentially on-site vendors, staffing agencies, et cetera, et cetera. So think about your workforce, not just your direct employees that you pay directly. Think about those workers that work alongside your workforce and job sites, and as I mentioned. So you have to incorporate this into your overall safety protocols for training and communication. Lastly, and because of the evolving nature of risk exposures, you have to have a dynamic assessment process where risks are reassessed regularly. I think a good plan, what I call a good plan, calls for regular and routine hazard reviews or audits in some respect, checking to make sure that physical safeguards are still in place, verifying the alarms still work, et cetera, et cetera. You have an ongoing obligation to review your plan at least annually. I say regularly, but at least annually per the new bill. But also any new risk, right? Any deficiency is identified, and also following an incident. These are all the times that we're going to do a reassessment of our workplace violence prevention plan and implement controls around. So the importance of this really can't be overstated. It's important that you have a designated designated responsible end quote person to be put in charge of this, to be assigned the responsibility, and also to be the conduit, really, when you think about planning and communication from your representatives, from the different functional areas of your organization. And it could be really, it could be anyone. It could be an HR or ER rep. It could be a safety manager or other informed person. One thing I think it's important to note, and for those on the call to know, that due to the nature of workplace violence, including employee information, personal information, subsequent investigations that take place, HR or ER, whichever responsibility your company has, should really be directly involved with the plan. But you have a choice, right? Under SB 553, there is no direct person. It's your choice. And of course, for your plan to be successful, as we talked about, your employees should be involved. Of course, when you think about how do I engage my employees, there's talk of surveys, there's polls you could do. That could be an avenue for consensus. But also make sure you have conversations with your team, right? I think ask them what their concerns are. What's their take on the risks they see every day? I'll tell you, employees will let us know about other risks we may have not even seen or known about. As an example, we can find out about a domestic situation boiling over the office or a facility with a particular worker that may have not been on our radar yet, or maybe really common issues involving a high-risk business being regularly impacted, potentially robbed, that sits near our workplace, or maybe it's a liquor store that's near our area where our employees park. So information is king. Talk to your folks. So there are a lot of sources of workplace violence that you probably haven't even thought of as well, right? So you think this is a good opportunity to address those points in a very clear, specific way, okay? And go above beyond, better than average, be best in class, make sure that the elements that you're looking for are addressed. Now, if you're in California, you can see the big orange bar at the bottom of the slide, which means you have a written program in place by July 1st. That's the deadline. So as of this presentation, that's a very short time frame. Okay, so addressing the elements of your plan really should have a point person in charge, as we talked about, implementing and maintaining the plan. There should be an effective procedures that involve all your employees in a proactive way. If you have a union in your shop, you should also involve the union for your hazard identification assessment. There should be ways that you're coordinating all of this all of the processes, all of the policies, all the plans, really on a daily basis. There should be procedures for training and communication by training. This is one of those questions that we're seeing on a regular basis since the bill will pass, and we'll address that. A question we see very often is, what does training mean under the bill? Who am I supposed to train? What about workplace violence? And the answer is everybody, right? You want to train everybody on workplace violence. Your supervisors should know how to identify and act with an incident. Employees should also know the threats or signs of threat of violence and strategies to avoid harm. You want to make sure everybody understands how to communicate and to whom, and without risk of retaliation or being discriminated against. And finally, how will you respond? What's your procedure? So I definitely want to highlight for you that you plan to be successful. Make sure there is always an open line of communication between your senior leadership and supervisors and managers and staff. And I think having a strong commitment to communicating and preventing workplace violence is key. And that's what we're here to do, right? Because we care and we want a safe work environment. So next here, the picture you're seeing is a screen of a snapshot of our own Berkshire Program Wizard. We made available to our policyholders some time ago, but of course many exist. Even Cal OSHA has also published their own model or template, which can be downloaded to start and develop your own workplace violence prevention plan. I think, what you want to do is have a plan. If you have a plan, identify those gaps that you want to address. And of course, there are many, many more plans and wizards and templates out there. But as we go through the plan guide, remember to reach out to either your Heffernan contact or your loss control partner, BHHC, if you're with us. If you have a question, this is why we're here. We're here for you. So this program guide, guys, our template wizards, you choose our tools, right? I think you want to use them to at least start or specialize your plan in your organization. So identify those elements, right? Who's in charge? Who are you identifying? How are you identifying, risk potential? Who's doing the risk assessments? How are you doing the assessments? How are you engaging your employees? How are you maintaining privacy? What about tracking incidents? So all of this information should be in your program. And so we'll recommend using some type of template program when possible to make your job easier if you haven't, when navigating and developing your workplace violence prevention plan. Here are some other documents you should have. You'll also need a method for record keeping and reporting. So here specifically, let's talk a little bit about the incident report. When an employer, when you report a threat of violence at your work, you should have some type of either hand documentation or software that you're tracking all of the key elements of that incident. Okay, make sure you're gathering all of the data. Who is involved? When did it occur? If the incident of assault or attack hasn't occurred yet, when is this supposed to happen, right? Do we have a date? Do we have a time? We have to note that. What type of threat is it? Was it a verbal threat? Was it a written threat? Was it a social media post, et cetera, et cetera? I was actually discussing a pretty recent incident that occurred at a rather small company that had several offices. At this specific office in this company, the AC system, it had been down for a couple of days, and it was one of those spurts that was exceptionally hot. They went through a spurt of several days that was hot, and so hot days, no AC. Obviously, there's some anger there. Someone took it upon themselves to prop a back door open and write on a piece of paper, quote, "Keep this door open or we'll kill you." Exclamation mark, end quote. And I share this example not because something happened, fortunately it did not, but because although it was meant as a joke to someone, I assume, when they did a review, when they looked at the investigation, what was actually perceived as a workplace joke could have been perceived as workplace violence or an actual threat to those workers, people in the office, customers, the visitors in the office. So an incident report was rightfully taken. Good for them, as it should have been. It was investigated, it was resolved and logged. So the importance of record keeping and reporting is really important. To continue, the workplace violent incident log is again part of your record keeping purposes. When incidents occur, the law outlines exactly what you need to have in it. And so Cal OSHA has put out a template, like I mentioned, as part of their model This is you're looking at one that we created for BHHC, but you want to be very diligent and thorough when communicating a threat or event on your log. And again, perhaps you'd want to put it in software to make it a little bit more streamlined, but it provides a couple of different purposes. One, record is a record keeping capability, right? For identifying what kind of information you need to be getting from these different reports or events or incidents. It really begets asking the right question when an incident like this happens. And secondly, for those that don't meet the threshold for identifying the kinds of things that Cal OSHA is going to be wanting to receive as part of that violent incident case reviews for future audits or follow-up, when they finally get around to expecting when that time comes. So record keeping is truly, truly important. The elements involved with the log are covered on this specific example. So take a look at the log. Hopefully you can see it. Sorry, it is rather small. You can see the date, time, location, detailed description. We'll talk about detailed here, or a description, outcome, consequence, the category or classification the threat falls under, right? We talked about earlier, 1 through 4. And for record keeping, you'll need to retain the log for 5 years. But this is the interesting thing, and think about it as you're developing your log. You should omit, or at least think about omitting, personal information in the log. So for example, I'll use Steve here, an example, Steve on chat. He came into work on Monday at 8 a.m. and he socked me in the stomach while I drank coffee at my desk. That's a report we got. Well, you wouldn't want to say Steve Hamilton came into the office at 8 a.m. and punched Mike Via in the stomach. You would probably want to record it. And again, we're thinking about privacy, much closer to maybe employee or subject A reported to work at 8 a.m. and assaulted employee B or subject B while sitting at his desk in the description. So we're thinking about a type 3, right? Worker on worker. So the idea is really behind this is the log is not the official summary of that incident. It's just a general summary of what happened in your company. So the personal information gets deleted from it, but that means that if something happens, you'll want to make sure that you have a separate file, right? Think back to the last slide, we talked about the incident report, or something similar to that, where you'll have the rest of the story with all of the detail, all of the follow-up that you want to keep as your regular HR or ER document and not as a log. And I say this because be aware that this log, this specific log that you'll have enacted at your company is available to everybody at their request. And we have to get it to them within 15 days and also at no cost. So this is really an open document. So please protect information whenever you can. Definitely around this log. Okay.
Hey, Mike, I'm
Yeah.
going to interrupt real quick. We had a question that popped up, and I know Heffernan has some resources, so I please forgive me for jumping in, but
Absolutely.
we can provide this log to Heffernan and to any of the attendees that really need it. The goal is to get you the resources you need, not to hold on to these like there's some kind of private thing. So we'll be giving all of the resources we have to Heffernan to supplement anything they already have in place. That way you have some options. So I wanted to throw that in real quick.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. That's great information. Again, I would tell you that OSHA provides this on their website, Cal OSHA, with a very specific log. Okay, closing out here on the log piece. Let's discuss the workplace violence, the checklist. And so a little different than the assessment, but you should have both, right? The inspection checklist really is designed to help you identify those hazards related to workplace violence. And as an example, I'll share, if you're working in an office or maybe a warehouse environment, are you aware of what workplace violence hazards can be involved? How can employees be threatened by someone who might be prone to workplace violence? Are my doors accessible to the public? Do I have locks? Do they work? Who has access to these locks? Do employees work in remote locations or leave possibly when it's already dark outside, right? Think about your employees that travel. Are they traveling overnight? Are they staying in hotels? Do your employees have access to workplace violence prevention resources and tools? And so again, this checklist is something that you, the employer, would go through and inspect. And also important, engage to your employees to make sure that you're doing these threat assessments. But we want to make sure that we have a good understanding around all of these pieces. This last document we'll talk about here is titled the Workplace Violence Risk Assessment, and we'll cover a few of these points, but you'll want to look at these pieces of your risk assessment, right? And I think I'll highlight just briefly a couple of them here, but you really need to consider when you do a risk assessment is assessing the hazards, right? Take a look at violent incidents in the past. Take a look at violence that happens or has happened in a similar workplace or industry. Look at the conditions under which the work is done, right? Think about the physical location and layout of your workplace. Remember, we talked about physical safeguards just a bit ago. Think about the potential interactions amongst individuals where the work is being done. So, when discussing this topic, it's important to think about what type of perpetrator violence can happen. Experts tell us that violence is a process as well as an act. Violence typically doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so, the experts tell us that when they take a look at post-active shooter incidents or mass violence, careful analysis of violent incidents show that violent acts are often the result of long developing identifiable trails of problems, conflicts, disputes, failures, etc. So think through this document. Again, this is just resource tool, like Steve mentioned. We can make it accessible to you. More to come. How am I looking on time, Lisa?
You're doing great. We are about 6 minutes out. Looks like we had a lot of Q&A going on during the presentation. I thought maybe we can hang out for a moment and get some more Q&As coming in if anybody has it, if that's
Absolutely.
okay with you.
Yep, I think there's a couple more slides here, and we can definitely touch base. We do have a couple of slides that touch on some Q&A that we've been getting, Steve and I, in the company.
Perfect.
And hopefully it'll answer some of the question. I know Steve probably needs some respite here from some of the questions. So I'll touch this. I do want to talk, that when we think about compliance, not just for SB 553 in California, but across all states, it really doesn't matter if you have a workplace violence prevention program. If you have policies and procedures in place now, we would still encourage you to review the material that we're going through. Just like all your safety programs, you really need to look at those documents annually and make sure they're addressing those things that are, currently in control of preventing or risk associated to your organization. In the same standard, right? We would take whether you're in California or South Dakota, if you're working in healthcare, home care, home health care, or just home care. Those are 3 different industries. Take the time to review your program protocols, ensure your risk potentials are identified. Workplace violence for OSHA is relatively still new. I think they really started talking about it in 1992, and their focus was really on late night retail establishments, usually by one person and open late and early mornings, end quote. That was in their study guide. And so that's 32 years ago. So think through your risks, look at your potentials. The unfortunate part as we, kind of wrap things up here is, workplace violence incidents have become so commonplace, they often don't even make the news anymore. So it's important that we ensure we know how to comply with the plan. So wrapping up here, just a quick visual guide to help you through your workplace violence, right? When you think about implementing, you want to make sure you have, your policies, your organizational responsibilities, someone designated, your plan in place, your SOP. You think about through your training and communication. And lastly, you think about being flexible with your plan, right? It has to be a dynamic plan. The training and coordination has to be flexible as well. Anytime you're assigning responsibilities, make sure that person is thoroughly trained and you have some evaluation, right? Some recovery and response, some controls around what happens afterwards.
Mike, why don't we run through a couple of the FAQs real quick so
Awesome.
we can wrap it up. In the chat, the folks that are asking, most of the questions really are related to exemptions. Am I exempt? I only have 10 employees. Am I exempt? I have a lot of remote employees. Am I exempt? I'm in this industry. I'm in that industry. Am I exempt? The answer to that is, well, you might be, but I would still anticipate that you might be cited if you don't have a program. So we're encouraging our policyholders and everybody who listens to us that you should have a program and you should work on addressing the risk potential that you have. The other questions we have, I'm based in New York. I've got employees here in California. Am I exempt? No, not really. I mean, if you have employees in California, you need to comply with the California regulations. Same thing as if I travel to New York, I have to comply with those regulations. So let's not focus so much on the word exemption. Let's focus more on getting the controls in place and addressing those moving forward. As far as the tools that are available, Heffernan has lots of resources. You know, reach out to Steve and Lisa. They're going to guide you to the right templates that you might need. They're going to help you with the resources that you might need. Training is another question that always pops up. How can I possibly train all my employees by July 1st? The short answer is do your very best. The long answer is I think it's really tough for Cal OSHA to get out to what, 5 million policyholders across California. I think if you're doing your due diligence, get that program in place, communicate it to your employees, you'll be in a much better spot than you are today. Okay, so let's get the program written. Let's communicate the elements to the employees, and then you can do some supplemental training down the road. I think that's really the best way to address it. And I'll let you wrap it up here, Lisa, because I know we're coming up on time here, but I can't guarantee which employees will be at work each site. Do I have to ID them by name in the response incident plan? No, your incident plan for each site-specific program really should be by job title or task. You're identifying risk by task. I have an employer that has 200 sites. They have to have individual site-specific plans for each one, and they're doing it really by task. So the healthcare task is this, the home care is this, the construction site risk is that. They have a homeless shelter, so they're addressing risk potential like that. So your controls really have to be site specific more than anything. So that's just a quick wrap up. I know we're coming up short on time, and I want to give the Heffernan folks a chance to respond too, but thank you very much for letting us, talk. You put a couple of safety people in a room, we're going to talk forever. So very much appreciate you allowing us to jump on the line here and talk about workplace violence. Lisa, I'll hand it back over to you folks.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Mike. Absolutely invaluable information, especially something that is new and a little scary to implement. And these details that you provided were amazing. So thank you. Hats off to you both. And as I said earlier, anyone has any questions, you are welcome to reach out to anybody at Heffernan. Again, if you're a policyholder with Berkshire Hathaway, there you go. Those are the people to reach out to. And we're, again, thankful for Berkshire Hathaway's participation today, as well as yours. And we look forward to continuing to support you in this endeavor. And if it's okay with everybody, if anybody does have some additional questions, if Steve and Mike, you wouldn't mind hanging out for maybe another 5 minutes?
Absolutely.
Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now so you can start to be yourself again.
Yeah.